Chapter 6. A Good Lead. "You look surprised," said Mr. Whittier. "I guess I gave away a secret." "Oh, it's all right," Nancy assured him without divulging what was racing through her mind. The pin might be going to Nancy Smith Drew, and here was her chance to find the heiress. Nancy did not reveal her thoughts, however. Smiling, she said, "I must confess I haven't the least idea who might be giving me a pin, but it sounds exciting. I don't suppose you want to tell me who he is?" The jeweler sighed. "I've told so much already, I guess it won't matter. He said his name was Mr. Nixon, and that he is from out of town." Nancy was startled. Was he Edgar Nixon? Was he a friend of the heiress, or of some other Nancy Drew? Maybe Edgar Nixon is going to give the pin to me, but there'll be some trick to it if he does, Nancy decided. Mr. Whittier looked at her quizzically. "You seem kind of worried," he remarked. "I'm sorry I said anything. And please, when Mr. Nixon hands you the pin, don't let on I gave away a secret." Nancy assured him she would not. Suddenly she smiled. "If this man is the person I think he is, he's related to someone I know very well. Would you mind telling me what he looks like?" "Well, he's kind of handsome, you might say," Mr. Whittier replied. "Very thin and dark." "What was he wearing?" Nancy asked. She was not surprised to learn that the purchaser of the pin had worn a camel's hair coat and hat. In her mind, this settled it. The buyer was indeed Edgar Nixon. But where did she possibly fit into the picture? Mr. Whittier handed Nancy the necklace. "Come in again soon," he invited her. "I'll have all my Christmas things on display next week." His suggestion gave Nancy an idea. Recalling a remark her father had made, she said, "Mr. Whittier, in a magazine advertisement I saw a special kind of cufflinks I know my dad would like. They were large gold squares and had diagonal stripes of black across them. I'd like a set to give to Dad for Christmas." "I know the pattern well," said Mr. Whittier. "I'll order a pair if you like." "Please do, and let me know when they come in." "Speaking of cufflinks," said the jeweler, "Mr. Nixon bought a pair for himself. Kind of flashy, but he seemed to like them. They were bright red and had a black star in the center." Instantly, Nancy thought what an excellent identification this was. Aloud, she said, "I don't think I'd care for them myself." Shortly thereafter, Nancy left the shop and walked to her convertible, deep in thought. She had just picked up 2 good leads. Nancy went directly to the Skeets home on Cottage Street. Although it was not far from the Drews, she had never been in this particular area. The houses were rather shabby, many of them needing paint, but they were neat and the windows glistened. The small lawns in front of them were well kept. Nancy drove slowly until she came to number 22. The bell knob on the Seaman's cottage door was brightly polished. In answer to Nancy's ring, the door was opened by a grizzled, elderly man. "Howdy," he said, smiling affably. "We don't want to subscribe to any magazines, thank ye." "I'm not selling anything," Nancy laughed. "I came to see Mrs. Skeets." "Well, she hoisted anchor here about an hour ago," he said. "I expect she just rode around to the chandler for some supplies, and most likely she'll be back by 6 bells. Nancy grinned. "You mean 11 o'clock, Mr. Skeets?" "Call me Sailor Joe like the rest of the folks." He grinned broadly. "Yes, miss. 6 bells on a ship is 11 o'clock. "Then your wife will be back very soon," Nancy said, glancing at her wristwatch. "May I wait?" "Heave your anchor, lass," Joe said. "Come into the parlor." Chuckling, he led Nancy into the living room. It was papered in deep red and furnished in a variety of shabby furniture. On the walls were pictures of ships, a broken but highly polished sextant, a lethal-looking spear, and a large dried starfish. Nancy sat down on a couch and remarked, "Sailing all over the world. You must have seen many interesting things, Mr. Skeets." "Aye, and so I have." Sailor Joe grinned, settling himself in a captain's chair. "Why, a funny thing happened to me one time when I had shore leave in Melbourne, Australia. For fun, I told one of the dockhands I was a pearl diver, and me not being able to swim a stroke. That night, after I'd gone to sleep, somebody came in and carried me away. Next thing I knew, I'd been shanghaied onto a boat that was really going pearl diving." Sailor Joe laughed uproariously. Nancy wondered what was so funny about this. Instead, it seemed tragic. "I see you don't understand the joke," the old salt went on. "You see, where I was brought up, us sailors meant washing dishes when we said pearl diving." The old man rocked with laughter and slapped his knees with great calloused hands. Nancy laughed too, but did not want Joe to get started on another one of his sea yarns. She was eager to ask him some questions before his wife returned. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. "Maybe a year, maybe 2, Joe said. My old woman moved out here so I'd be far from the sea and maybe stay home more. But I could smell salt water if I was in the middle of a desert. Speaking of deserts, I must tell you," Nancy interrupted quickly. "Did you ever know a young woman by the name of Nancy Drew?" "Nancy Drew? Well, I'll say I did, and a trim little figurehead she was, and as neat as an admiral's cutter. Did you know her?" Nancy shook her head. "I'm trying to locate a Nancy Smith Drew who's wanted in England," she said. Sailor Joe whistled. "Wanted in England, is she? And for what? That girl never did a wrong thing in her life." "Oh, she isn't wanted by the authorities," Nancy hastened to say. "A relative died and left her some money." "Aha! That's a jib of another cut." Joe grinned. "Yes, Nancy Smith Drew used to room with my missus in New York. She kept a rooming house then. Well, well, I'm glad Miss Drew come into some money, for she was hard up, that she was. Studying for the stage, and a fine figure of an actress she'd a made. Tall and beautiful, with a fine, deep voice." Nancy was excited. "Where is Nancy Smith Drew now?" Sailor Joe went on. "She couldn't get to sign with no theater, and at last she left us to go to some beach with a family as a governess." Nancy was wildly elated at this clue. "When was this?" she asked. "Oh, that was maybe 10... No, not that long. Let me see now. I remember I brought her back a souvenir and she was gone when I docked. What did I bring her? You'd never guess. A little monkey. I got it from a Portuguese down in Brazil. I'd made a voyage to Rio why, I remember now. It was just 8 years ago next spring that Miss Drew left us." 8 years ago? Nancy's heart sank. "Do you remember the name of the family she went with?" she asked. Sailor Joe pursed his lips and frowned. Presently he said, "English folks, I think. Name of Hilt or something. Or was it Washington? You know what? I gave that monkey to a man in exchange for a pair of boots." As the old man burst into laughter again, Nancy felt more encouraged than ever, now that she had found another clue. Her thoughts were interrupted by an exclamation from Joe. "Ahoy! Here comes the missus now. I know her step on the quarterdeck." He jumped to his feet and rushed to open the door for Mrs. Skeets. Her arms were loaded with bundles. "Brisket corned beef is what you'll get for supper because it's the cheapest cut in the market," the woman announced. "Salt horse again!" exclaimed her husband. "Well, never mind. We got company." Mrs. Skeets walked into the living room and saw Nancy. It's you, is it?" she sniffed. Without another word, she passed through to the rear of the house, and it was some minutes before the woman returned. "Did you bring the money?" she asked. "Hey, what's all this palaverin' about?" Joe demanded in annoyance. "This is the young lady who's responsible for the disappearance of the letter from your sister that had $10 in it. I went around to her house. I suppose you've got the money with you." Joe looked from his wife to Nancy in bewilderment. "But this young lady didn't steal the money, did she?" "I'm asking no questions," Mrs. Skeet said stiffly. "All I want is our $10. Nancy smiled at Sailor Joe. "I'm glad you don't think I stole the money," she said. "Of course I didn't. A batch of letters was taken from our house, and your wife seems to think that a letter from your sister was among them." "Well, I ain't gonna let you pay 1 cent, Joe roared. "Not even a stevedore would agree to that." "Nevertheless, I made a bargain with your wife," Nancy told him. "I said I would give her the $10 in exchange for some information about Nancy Smith Drew." "You see," Mrs. Skeet said loftily. "Well, a bargain's a bargain. Let me see the $10 and then I'll talk." Nancy took the money from her purse and held it up. She told the woman of the conversation that she had had with her husband. "I understand that Nancy Smith Drew was engaged as a governess by some English people several years ago." "That's right, but Joe told you too much. Course, this was a long time ago, and I don't think it'll do you much good trying to find Nancy Smith Drew there. The name of the people was Wilson, and they was staying at the Breakers Hotel somewhere on Cape Cod." Nancy turned over the $10 bill and started for the door. "Thank you both for the information. I shall try hard to find this other Nancy Drew. Mrs. Skeets, ask your husband to tell you about her inheritance." As soon as Nancy reached home, she consulted the long-distance operator in order to dial the Breakers Hotel on Cape Cod. Finally, she was given the number and put in the call. The man who answered said the place was closed for the winter. He was only the caretaker. "I'm trying to locate people named Wilson who perhaps spend the summers there," Nancy said. "Could you give me their winter address?" "No," the man replied. "I don't know the names of the summer guests, and all the hotel's books are locked up. Maybe if you call next summer you can find out." Nancy put down the phone and stared into space. Once more she had run into a stone wall. How should she proceed now? As she sat lost in thought, the phone rang. She picked up the instrument and said, "Hello." "Hi, Nancy." "Ned!" "How's everything?" Ned Nickerson asked. "You mean about the weekend? Just fine. Bess and George and I are driving up on Friday. We'll come right to Omega Chi Epsilon House, okay?" "That's what I was going to ask you to do. You girls will be staying here." "Ned," Nancy said, "I'm busy solving 2 new mysteries." She went on to give him a detailed account of Edgar Nixon, the stolen mail, and finally the mysterious letter which had come from England for Nancy Smith Drew. At the end, she laughed and said, "Of course, I expect your help." It was Ned's turn to chuckle. "I might be able to help you sooner than you think. You know there's to be a play Friday night, one of Shakespeare's. The Dramatic Society engaged a coach to come out from New York especially for it. She's a woman, and her name is N. Smith Drew." End of chapter 6.